Well, I think that we may start at that moment. We have already more than 20 participants of this talk. So I would like to welcome all of you. And we have as today's speaker, we have Magda Otta. Magda is working on his PhD at Sheffield, and she is a PhD student at Sano Center. And as a promoters of her PhD are here at Sano, Maciek Malawski, and at Sheffield, there are two persons who are taking care of what Magda is doing, namely Andrew Narakot and Ian Holiday. Well, you know all of them. I think that you will also be able to see them during discussion after Magda's talk. And if you have any urgent question, please put it on the chat or on questions and answers, so I will be able to transfer this question to Magda. Well, Magda, screen is yours, and please go on.
Thank you for the introduction. So good afternoon, everybody. I was asked to speak about my PhD research today. The topic is on the screen. I joined Sano and started my PhD at the University of Sheffield in late 2021. So right now I have about a year left to submit my thesis. And to set your expectations for this talk, I will speak for about 30 minutes, give or take. I'll tell you about modeling in the context of deep vein thrombosis. I will start by introducing the clinical background, then I'll quickly overview cardiovascular modeling concepts. And after that, I'll show you my work, including two types of numerical models I have been working on with example results focusing on sensitivity analysis. I will then put everything into the clinical workflow, and hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll see that what I'm doing makes sense and eventually could be medically useful. So before we dive into the meat of the talk, here's a slide summarizing people involved in this research. Most of them Marian already mentioned. One person additional to that is Mr. Chang Lim, who's a vascular surgeon from the Royal Free London NHS Foundation Trust Hospitals. The model development is informed by direct collaboration with him, and the computational workflow is designed to be positioned within the clinical pathway utilized in that clinic. And this is where the topic for this research came from. So I'll start with the clinical context. Deep vein thrombosis is a condition in which blood clots form in deep veins of the lower limb for the wrong reasons. It affects roughly 1 to 2 people per 1,000 in the general population. And factors leading to DVT are summarized by Virchow's triad, which includes damage to the vessel wall, which exposes parts of the vessel that are strongly prothrombotic. It doesn't have to be literal physical damage. It can be an inflammation response. 2, hypercoagulation, when your blood is more sticky than it should be. This is more biological. And 3, abnormal flow patterns like vertices, retrograde flow, to the point where it disturbs the functioning of the vein. This is the physics of blood flow called hemodynamics. And I'm mainly interested in the last, which out of the 3 is arguably the least understood in the context of DVT. So why should we care about DVT? Among people suffering from venous thrombosis, up to 40% goes unnoticed, but from those diagnosed, 1/3 dies within months, mainly of pulmonary embolism, which is when a part of a thrombus breaks off and travels to lungs, eventually blocking a pulmonary artery, which is much smaller in diameter than veins in legs. So up to 50% will develop long-term complications known as post-thrombotic syndrome, PTS, and this means persistent DVT symptoms despite treatment. It is a syndrome, so you get a range of symptoms varying between patients. So it is a condition in which personalization of treatment could potentially help. There is no gold standard in PTS handling. It won't kill you, but it will reduce the quality of life significantly, especially in severe cases. And so patients require long-time care, and this means burden on healthcare systems. And that is why it is important to treat DVT effectively. So DVT treatment varies between hospitals. I'm basing my research on the Royal Free in London because we collaborate with that clinic. And on the slide is a summary of what happens. You can distinguish acute and chronic DVT. Acute means the thrombus is fresh, less than 14 days old, which also means it's relatively soft. Chronic is generally over 2 months old. No, clots change over time. Older clots are harder and can cause scars. So the first step is having a CT scan or MRI with contrast. It may depend on the availability of the machine, but it's more likely that an acute patient will get a CT because it's faster to get. Chronic patients are less urgent. There's more time. They're planned for. So they're more likely to get an MR and even a Doppler ultrasound as a bonus. Then there's IVUS, intravascular ultrasound, where you can see the vein from the inside. And this is a part which may not be as common in other hospitals. So based on the imaging, a surgeon plans the treatment. It happens during an angiogram, and some decisions are made on the fly. So they enter a vein with a catheter, insert contrast, and see exactly where the blockages are. And that is when they can insert a dissolving agent, which is called thrombolysis, or remove the clot mechanically, that's thrombectomy, or put a stent to open up the lumen of the vessel, or a combination of either. It depends on the patient. Sometimes it's even impossible to insert the catheter everywhere you want because the veins are so stenosed. An interesting fact is that after initial MR, they have an idea. They do IVUS, and in half the cases, it changes the idea of the disease. If there is scar tissue, for example, in MR venogram, it can seem open, but in IVUS, it is visible as this white shadow around the vessel. I don't want to spend too much time on this. The key point to take is that decision-making here is mainly based on images. So the physics, the geometry of the vessels, there isn't much other information. And the problem is some patients have further complications and others don't. So say you put a stent in a similar place in 2 patients and one gets restenosis and the other doesn't. These are the types of things I'm trying to investigate with modeling, provide more information, because what you need to understand is this hasn't been investigated before. So we are very much at the beginning of the path towards any clinical implementation. So moving on to cardiovascular modeling. This slide is to convince you that there is space for novel work in this area. In the top right, you can see an example bar plot from a literature search I did. The blue bars represent the number of studies related to venous modeling and red those of the arteries. The table below shows a set of different phrases searched. I looked at the first 100 best matches, and the last 2 columns show you the number of papers related to veins and arteries. So people never focused as much on modeling veins as they did for the arteries. So on the left, there is a set of papers that provide a good context of my work. The first 2 are about treating DVT and PTS. Then there is a condensed book about the physics of the cardiovascular system. And finally, there are 2 papers about modeling. First is an overview of modeling methods, and the last one is a paper about a model that includes veins. It's one of like 4 papers that I found at the time about numerical modeling of veins, 3 of which were written by the same guys. So what I want you to get from this is that there is a decent background of the disease in question, a very good background on the well-established approach to cardiovascular modeling, and quite a poor representation of the venous system, especially in the context of DVT. I actually found nothing on that at the time. So I've mentioned modeling several times. Let me clarify what type of modeling I do, because I've had people confused before. There are generally two types of modeling: data-driven, where you know the data points but don't know the law behind them, and you use statistics to predict the system's behavior. This is how all the AI stuff works. I do not do that. And to answer your unavoidable question of why, because there is no data to do it, I will have data from 20 patients in total. Some of them will be from acute and others from chronic DVT cases, so there will be a mismatch even in the input. So I do law-driven modeling. I know the rules of the physics of blood flow. I know the vessel geometry because it's imaged in the clinic, and I combine the two to predict what happens in the blood vessels. And on the slide, you can see somewhat typical workflow in modeling. So you have a world you want to model. You choose to represent that world in a certain way. Like here, the systemic circulation could be represented as simply as a 6-parameter model. Whether it's useful or not is another question. You can describe the world in different ways, and you evaluate these descriptions based on what you need the model to do. So to simulate something, we need to have input data, in my case, anatomical data, based on which we calculate parameters that go into the model, solve the model, and then to make it all mathematically robust, we can also vary the parameters and use statistics to understand how that variation influences what the model predicts. So in cardiovascular modeling, there is this dimensionality concept. In 0D models, variables can vary with time, but there is no spatial variation. And 1D models introduce a variation along a single direction, which could be the vessel center line, for example. It allows to account for things like wave reflections, at bifurcations, among other things. 2D models have two spatial dimensions. For a vessel, it's usually the radius and the center line, and these aren't very popular. In 3D, we account for all spatial directions and time, and they provide the most detailed solution, but also at the highest computational cost. It is close to impossible to model everything in 3D, but the local regions of interest. So if you combine the models, you get a multi-scale model, and they usually work better than simulating, for example, isolated 3D elements. These models compute hemodynamic variables, such as those listed on the slide. And in my research, I'm combining the 0D and 3D modeling. And so I'll explain them in more detail now. So 0D modeling predicts global hemodynamics. You treat the vasculature as an electrical circuit where a vessel or a compartment of multiple vessels are represented by a resistor-capacitor pair. Capacitor represents compliance, which is the volume of blood the vessel can hold in response to pressure rise. Resistances are calculated under precise assumption, where vessel is assumed to be a cylinder of fixed dimensions. Compliance is calculated based on wave speed. It's related to Young's modulus and wall thickness. The blood is treated as incompressible fluid with constant density and viscosity. And I'll talk about the model in the steady state and transient, so varying with time. And in the end, it is an ODE model that I wrote in Python. So this is the model. It's an open loop with flow from the left side to the right. Here are the arteries involved, included, and veins, with 3 outlets of the network and 4 capillary beds in each leg connecting arteries to veins. So in total, there are 50 elements informed by 53 blood vessels and 8 capillary beds data. So putting it into the modeling workflow, the input data are vessel geometry parameters such as radius and length. For the average patient, we used this publication because we didn't have the data at the time, but in principle, we could use patients' images to personalize the whole network, whether it's necessary is under investigation. Resistances and compliances of the model are calculated from there. There are 50 of each, and we use pressure boundary conditions. For steady state, there is a fixed value of 80 millimeters mercury at the inlet. For transient, it is oscillating around that value, and pressure at all outlets is set to 0. It's an open loop model, but you could close it or you could prescribe a feedback function at the outlet. That's all under consideration. So what comes out directly are pressure waveforms in every compartment. The visibly oscillating ones here come from arteries. The middle is from the capillary bed, and at the bottom from veins, which are almost non-oscillating. And this is what would be expected from such a system. So these pressures can be post-processed into other metrics, such as flow rate and wall shear stress and so on. And we conducted sensitivity analysis to investigate how variation in the input radii, so the anatomy, influences flow and pressure metrics in the system. So we conducted local and global sensitivity analysis on models in steady state and transient setup. Local tells you how a change in the input influences the output, and radii are varied one at a time. So with 53 inputs, that's 107 simulations, including the base state. So you can see how the DOS highlights every simulation case. Then you calculate the local index. So Q is the example output, and R is the input. So the change in the output over the change in the input for a given case. For global sensitivity analysis, we performed Sobel analysis, which tells you how a change in the input influences the output's variance, and all input radii are varied together based on the Saltelli sequence. There you compute first-order interactions as one, and they tell you how a change in a single parameter influences the output variance. Second-order interactions tell you how pairs of parameters do that, and so on. And then you can also compute total order interactions, ST. For a given parameter, they tell you about a total contribution of that input from all the interaction that is involved in for a given output. And because it is based on statistics, you need to run enough cases for the indices to converge, so be statistically significant. And for the steady state model, it was about 100,000 runs. For the transient, over 3.5 million, which posed quite a computational challenge. So in steady state, a single execution on my machine takes less than a second. So 100,000 would take about 30 hours. Transient needs 3.5 million. That would be about 2 months, but more likely a fried laptop. It is a parallel problem, and so with the help of Piotr from our team, we ran the model on AWS, which worked great for the steady state. Transient would be a bit too much with the number of samples and associated storage required, so it was containerized and ran on ARS HPC. In both cases, the fully converged analysis can be achieved within 1 working day. The key point is this is not about a single model execution size, but the number of executions needed that creates this computational challenge. So to show you what this convergence is, here are first-order Sobel indices for an example output, one of the 50 flows computed in the steady state and transient. So pink bars are the values of indices, and error bars come from confidence. On the left, you can see the number of samples included. So in the steady state, by this n equals 10 sampling depth, you can see the error bars being, the error bars being quite small. All indices are positive and their sum is less than 1, which is expected from S1 indices. There are a few metrics like that you account for. And for the transient setup of the model, where compliance plays a part, at the same sampling depth, we still basically see noise. Similar convergence is reached at around n equals 15, which means over 3.5 million runs of the model. So moving on to results after reaching convergence. This slide shows an example of flow metric in the steady state compared to mean flow in the transient case for both local and global sensitivity analysis. In the global case, it is first order S1 indices. X-axes are the input radii, y-axes are the outputs, and the heat map cells represent the index values. So you can see the similarities between the two local cases, between the two global cases, but also some overlap between local and global, with additional information coming from the global assay. So from the clinical point of view, you may be interested in hemodynamics of a specific vein, say common iliac, which is where you can find a thrombus. So flow through that vein is highlighted now. That's the yellow row. If there are any hotspots in that row, they'd represent the input radii of vessel sewage influence that output flow. So you can order those radii according to the index value and highlight those with most influence. And here, red box is the common iliac vein. Yellow boxes are compartments related to identified input parameters. And they are fairly consistent between analyses for this particular output, with some subtle differences. I won't talk much more about that. You can take a look at the conference paper we published 2 years ago on the steady state analysis, and there is a journal paper in preparation that covers the full sensitivity analysis work that we've done. The key points to take here are that SA is significant because one, venous anatomy is quite variable between patients, and we need to know what is significant. Two, thrombosis is it effectively changes the anatomy. It narrows the vessel. So with this analysis, you can predict what kind of changes will have an effect on the blood flow. It can then inform model reduction, further development, and eventually personalization. So to look at the details of flow in regions of interest, we do 3D modeling. The geometry of interest is extracted from medical images and constructed as a set of 3D pipes, basically. Then 0D model is used for the initial setup of boundary conditions, and we compute the same hemodynamic variables here as in 0D, but this time we can look at their variation within the vessel. So on the slide, there's an example geometry of iliac veins unification with computed velocity and wall shear stress. You may ask how this is related to thrombosis, and it would be an excellent question. There is no simple answer here, but we have some hypotheses. So, for example, regions of low shear stress have been associated with promoting thrombus development because of some recirculation of blood, and you can see a region of low wall shear in this output figure when the two vessels come together. So this region is likely to be prone to thrombus development. So technically what happens is we have our input data, both average and patient-specific, and we create idealized and patient-specific anatomy. So the idealized geometries are generated with CAD tools. Medical images need to be segmented with other tools. And from there, we have 3D surfaces that we feed to meshing tools, such as Snappy Hex Mesh and OpenFirm, Salome, which is an open source tool, or ANSYS Fluent Mesher, to get volume meshes, so 3D grids of cells dividing the geometry. In every cell of the grid, we solve the Navier-Stokes equations using OpenFOAM and ANSYS Fluent, and these equations describe the fluid flow, which in this case is blood with appropriate viscosity and density setup. So for now, we're assuming an incompressible Newtonian model in this steady state. Next step would be to run a set of transient analyses. The change of the blood model is also considered, but veins are quite big vessels, so using a Newtonian model is justified. These numerical simulations can take up to a few hours, even in the steady state, and that's why we only look at small local domains. So far, I have been working mainly with idealized geometries. The ongoing work focuses on a form of sensitivity analysis as well. I started by looking at the influence of the change in boundary conditions and the parameters of the geometry on the local hemodynamics. So on the slide, you can see the velocity distribution for two different angles between the veins at 30 and 60 degrees here, with 55 being the literature angle. On the right, the angle is at 55 degrees, but we're varying the inlet velocities. The first column is resulting velocity distribution, and the second associated wall shears for those geometries. The changes in boundary conditions on display are quite big, so you can see an equally big variation in the size of the low wall shear regions. And to assess this clinically, the possible variation range of the boundary conditions would have to be established in some principled way. But it shows you that there is a relationship between the boundary conditions and the size of the possible recirculation region. So the goal is to use this information to find a metric that would be indicative for DVT, like the size of the wall shear region below a certain threshold. This would allow to provide a risk metric that could be incorporated in the clinical workflow. The geometries I showed you are CAD generated. We just got access to clinical data, and in the next steps, we will segment vessel geometries from medical images. I already had some brief experience in running patient-specific geometries in a different project. Nevertheless, this idealized work is still very useful because idealized geometries are controllable in ways patient-specific geometries aren't. So you can tease out what features create certain effects. And the plan is to also investigate the significance of the feature resolution on the computed hemodynamics. So how different the results are between idealized and patient-specific geometries, how patient-specific do we need to go for this application, and so on. And just to mention, I acquired additional funding from the National Science Center Poland in the form of Preludium grant for 12 months to do more 3D work, this time focusing on statistical shape modeling. This is a method that allows to investigate the variation in shape in a population. The shape is decomposed into modes of deformation based on the data, and among other things, it allows to generate phantom geometries within observed population variation, which you can run more CFD analysis on. I'll use a set of patient-specific and idealized geometries, but unlike many AI methods, for example, this doesn't require as many input data sets. And like I said before, we only have images from 20 patients. So it's worth noting again, the venous anatomy is complex, so the ability to describe a population with a set of 20 is quite limited. But we can sort of sample the hemodynamic space by running these phantom geometries generated with this method. So the point is to make a link between variation in the 3D anatomy and CFD flow metrics. It is in very early stages. I just started last month. And like I said, it is additional funding. So the topic is non-essential for my PhD research, just a possible nice complementary work. On its own, it would be not, it wouldn't work because shape is not the only contributing factor to the hemodynamics, as you saw in the previous slide with the boundary condition changes. So to put it all back in the clinical context, the goal of my research is to make a link between patient-specific venous anatomy and the CFD hemodynamic metrics. This could potentially help to assess the risk associated with thrombus development within the vascular network, but also those treatment techniques that affect the physics of things. So, for example, stent placement, at least on the global scale, because I'll not investigate the details of stent construction. This clinical problem isn't well investigated yet, so more than anything, we want to assess the application of the modeling in this area in collaboration with the clinicians who know what could be useful. And if it is possible, there are a couple of points within the DVT clinical workflow where a model could fit. And these are after imaging of the disease, before invasive intervention, to plan for the procedure better. So far, I have published one first author conference paper on sensitivity analysis. An expanded sensitivity analysis work will be described in a journal paper that is in progress right now. We plan to submit it within a month or so. So for the remaining year of my PhD, we're planning 2 more journal papers, one on the 3D work within my PhD research, and one on the statistical shape modeling work. So stay tuned for the updates.
Many thanks. And since we have no time for question and for discussion, what we have on the list? We have Olaf. Go on, please.
Hello, so very nice presentation. So actually I'm a little bit curious. There were 2 things. So the first is, do you consider gravity for the CFD thing? So we are upright, our veins do behave a little bit different, I think, if we are laying down. The second would be, I'm curious how much a valve would influence local pressure or something like that. So that are you considering to?
Right. So it certainly would have an effect. We do not consider that for now. The patients are in the. So the images are when patients are lying down, getting an MR or CT. So that's the conditions under which we have the data.
Okay, but you could probably simulate how much difference gravity would do, or in a physical model.
Yes, I could probably do that. And I'm not saying I will not do that at some point. I'm just saying we haven't done that yet. Kind of depends on the time scale.
Okay, understood.
Well, I invite everybody to ask questions. Wiesław, you are in the queue, so please go on. Wiesław? Hello? Wiesław, we cannot hear you.
Maybe you can write in the chat.
So this is a good idea. Olaf, you still have a question?
No, sorry, just forgot to lower my hand.
Oh. I also saw. So let's wait for Wiesław. And well, there was a moment when I saw a question coming from somebody who has disappeared at that moment. So we are still waiting for question from Wiesław, who raised his hand, and well, I have a question. Could you please come back to list of your publications for a while? Because I think that well, you have a journal publication of 3D work, statistical modeling. Do you plan something, a kind of summary which will somehow overview all of these approaches and decide which approach is better, or some govern features of all these approaches? I think that it would be quite useful in this case.
I haven't really considered that. I focus on specific modeling parts. But yeah, that could be. I think it depends on the results a little bit. You know, if there's enough to be published.
It seems
but,
that
definitely, what I would consider is maybe in more of a clinical context, and combine these modeling concepts in more of a clinical setup, and not just because so far I've only worked on very technical publications.
And also at this moment, I think it would be interesting to which extent you had up to now contacts with clinicians, and have a chance to let's say to look at the results of your research and congratulate about something.
Right. So initially, I was meeting the clinicians, you know, once in a while. Recently, because we're approaching the end of my PhD, we're meeting quite regularly. The last time I spoke to the clinicians was a couple of weeks ago to discuss the data, and they are informed about all the results of the research. They're also co-authors of the publications, so it is very much the work is very much informed by their inputs. You know, it's what's useful comes from them, and we try to direct the work so that it helps them.
Okay, thank you. And well, I have a question from John Fenner. Well, this is a question. Were compression cuts associated with DVT? Does your work have implication for this?
Compression cuffs.
Compression cuts associated with DVT.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm not exactly sure if he means like compression socks with compression of the veins. I'm assuming that's.
Well, so for this reason, I would
So
like
that supports the venous return. So for now, we don't have any additional feedback functions in the model, but things like the respiratory effects, which are kind of similar area to the compression socks, could also be implemented. We discussed this.
Okay.
So I'm not including that in the model.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, thank you for this elegant presentation. And it's of course a challenging problem. I have three simple questions. First,
Okay.
how do you plan to validate your model?
That's an excellent question.
What is an excellent answer?
So the data are retrospective, so we do have some idea of how the treatment went. But other than that, that's a challenging part. And part of the challenge is also at the current stage not knowing what exactly will be the metric. You know, because if we want to focus on wall shear, for example, that's not something that's measured in the clinics, or there would have to be some other way to get around that. I don't want to say I don't know, but at this stage, it's not as clear.
Okay, and then the second question is about patient-specific data. How you can get this kind of data? My understanding is that so far you use MR angio, CT angio, but is it sufficient to get the complete patient-specific data for your model?
Yeah, so you get a 3D because of the so from MR and CT, you get the cross sections. You can reconstruct the 3D geometry. Of course, you can argue how accurate that is because of the image resolution, contrast differences.
What about mechanical properties?
So there's no wall fluid interactions in the model right now. We only we only get the geometry from the data. That's the only thing that's measured.
Because there's also some MR elastography, so you can get some mechanical properties from magnetic resonance if you need this kind of parameters.
I mean, it's interesting, but it's more about trying to fit the model to the current clinical workflow than adapting the clinical workflow to fit the model, if you see what I mean. So we only get what they measure.
Okay, so talking about clinical workflow, how do you think how a surgeon can use your work? I know that it's still too early, but what is your prediction? Yeah.
So for example, I mentioned something like IVUS, when they do intravascular ultrasound, it changes like half of the planning they would do based on the MR imaging. And it's an invasive procedure, so one of the things would be maybe this could provide similar information that imaging techniques in place. So, you know, when they have the patient on the table, they would do imaging, and then they could run the model to have a better idea of the disease instead of doing more invasive procedures. So that's one of the things.
Do you think that the surgeon needs such a complicated model?
I don't think it would be the model in the current form. So this work tries to find this link between the geometry and the hemodynamics. And when we know how it behaves, maybe it could be reduced and condensed into something which isn't as even computationally expensive, right?
You know that lower limb is not a sort of my favorite organ of interest anyway. I have observed some procedures and I give you some clue. I don't know if it's useful or not. I know in Poland a surgeon who is very talented. He made his PhD within 5 weeks. 5 weeks. And his promoter was Dr. Leliga.
Right.
Dr. Leliga. He also spent some time in Kapstadt, in Barnard's clinic and so on. And then he switched to treatment of lower limb thrombosis. And his procedure is the following. Since the vessels in this region are quite redundant, it's not like in the brain that if something is occluded, you need to make it patent. Here, if something is occluded, you just eliminate it. So what he does, he uses ultrasound, he injects some foam, and after 15 minutes, you are done. The patient is treated, meaning there's no danger that there's any embolus and so on. So what I'm saying is another extreme, that there's no need for a very complicated model, but just for a sort of local focus using ultrasound, checking where is the problem, and very non-invasive treatment.
Well, from my discussions with our clinical contacts, I would argue a little bit because one of the aspects of the problem is that you treat the patients and it's okay at the time, but then some patients no longer have symptoms and other get restenosis, right? So they get thrombosis back within a couple of years. So part of the risk assessment would be also like why a particular treatment worked for that patient and didn't for another one.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is that it's not the issue of, you know, opening the vessel, it's just opposite. Closing the vessel not to cause any problems because there's lots of redundancy in the lower limb.
Yeah, it's kind of return of blood at all costs.
Okay. Anyway, you can just think about also some potential applications. Yeah. Okay, thank so good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sław, for questions, for suggestions, and for discussion. I think that it will be useful for Magda.
My pleasure.
Yes, I think, and well, of course, it's many other opportunities to do this. Well, for a while, I saw a question from Keith. Keith, it was a mistake, or I hope that you wanted to ask the question.
You can't surely expect me to admit to making a mistake, Marian.
No.
Well, Wisław has kind of crept in on my question, but Magda, I think all our experience suggests that there are a number of barriers to clinical adoption, one of which is the difficulties around disrupting existing clinical workflows. Assuming that a simplified, validated, personalized system can indeed provide information that is seen to assist clinicians, how do you see this becoming part of a clinical workflow? And do you see it as a standalone additional facility, or maybe as part of a more elaborate decision support system that has many components?
So I certainly see it as a step in the workflow that could potentially reduce, let's say, the poking of the patient. I think I mentioned that when they do an angiogram, many decisions happen on the fly. They can do several things. Sometimes, the venous stenosis to such an extent that they cannot put a catheter everywhere they would want. So if they knew that beforehand, they wouldn't have to do some of the things. So I see it as a tool that could make the decision making easier and the treatment less invasive to an extent.
Okay. So really, you're saying this treatment at the moment, this process at the moment, is one that is used to a bit of disruption because it's quite difficult to plan effectively. There are likely to be unknowns in the process. So a bit of disruption by introducing a new process should be tolerated well by the clinicians.
Yes, I believe so.
But you think that this process, the information from this system, is enough on its own to be useful? You don't need some sort of an AI-driven decision support, multifaceted mechanism to help out?
I knew an AI question would come up. So I think at this stage, it's hard to say that it would be enough because we're focusing only on the physics. We're focusing on physics by calculating it in a quite computationally expensive way. So depending what comes out of that analysis would inform the next steps, and maybe some further processing of the results, maybe with some AI, could help to make the a risk assessment tool more efficient, better. But it may as well need more information, from the biological and physiological aspects. So I'm just investigating if the physics of the flow would be enough to design a tool that could still be useful in the clinic.
No, I feel for you. Your working life is one surrounded by AI experts, so you need a bit of support to justify how laws of physics solutions can often be.
You can design an AI algorithm that includes the CFD sort of results as a feature, right?
Don't give in to them.
Yeah.
Fine. Thank you, Magda.
Many thanks, Keith. Thank you very much for taking part in the discussion. Well, we have Olaf now in the queue.
Yeah, I thought of a few other questions, and actually I have three of them. The first is, well, when you do a physical model and you have some measurements, one of the most interesting measurements would be some before and after treatment. So do you have access to those? That's the first question.
So before treatment are all the images I mentioned. After, not always. So you may get an ultrasound as a follow-up from some patients, but the most post-treatment imaging you get is because they do the treatment during an angiogram. So you can see, before treatment, they insert the contrast, they do something like angioplasty, stent, whatever. And then they insert the contrast again to see if the flow improved. And that's sort of immediately after treatment.
Okay. Well, you don't have pressure measurements before and after at certain.
No, there's no measure of any hemodynamic variables.
Okay. That's most unfortunate, because then the geometry, with exception of the treated part, would be the same, and that would be a very sensitive thing to test your model. The second question is, are you in the laminar or in the turbulent regime with your Reynolds numbers?
Laminar, at least in those idealized geometries for now.
Okay, good. And the last one is, what is the most labor-intensive part in the model? So to set up the model here, is it the geometry, getting the geometry to something that is watertight for the 3D simulation, or is it some other parameterization? So how would background of my question is, how could a software help you more in getting to your results faster? So what is your manual work? What is taking up the most time here?
Right. So obviously in the 3D modeling, that's the much more intensive, the 0D. And then I think for me, the hardest part is to getting the initial geometries of sufficient quality to later mesh them and run them. Because you can optimize the meshing and running the simulation in many ways. But your geometry needs to be good enough. So if you do idealized geometries, parameterizing that and then segmentation of the geometries from the images, so that they're, because you need to make many decisions. They're like, what's good enough? What the feature resolution should be? Is the contrast good enough? So getting that initial surface mesh, I would say that's the most labor intensive part.
Okay, I take that as a work item for our partners here at RWTH.
Okay.
Oh, well, do we have more questions? Well, if not, I would be happy to give floor screen for a while to Ian Holiday and Maciek. Could you please add something to?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you.
So, I mean, I thank you very much, Magda, for an outstandingly clear and concise presentation. And I echo some of Keith's comments around the, you're surrounded by machine learning experts and you're there working on a mechanical model. But let's remember that mechanical models actually provide insight and actually join up. Only with a mechanical model can you start to investigate hypotheses, I think, with any depth. And my experience is that clinicians actually prefer models with a mechanical foundation for that precise reason. Just picking up on a couple of Olaf's questions and around the validation. I think, Magda, your model will provide the clinicians with a statistical view. What I mean by that is that you'll be able to perform simulations which are multi-scale. You have a 0D component to your investigation, which is very, very large scale. It can view the whole of the, you can see the whole of the limb and lower body, and yet you have parts of your investigation which are very detailed, and you rationalize that information and you bring it together and you combine the physics in such a way that you will be able to identify parts of the circulation which are most prone to thrombus formation. And whether or not that chimes with clinical intuition, or whether it, it chimes with the statistics of occurrence of, I think that's the first way in which your modeling process, your workflow will interface with clinical data at the statistical level. And I'd be surprised if you weren't able to provide insights in that respect. I think that you will be able, I think at the end of your PhD, you will be able to draw some fairly firm and mechanically founded conclusions about what parts of the circulation, the lower leg circulation, are most atheroprone. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate that I've not given, and I've not said anything precise there, but I think that's a point worth making. One has to start with, really complex clinical problems with a qualitative understanding, and that qualitative understanding progresses to a quantitative understanding in incremental steps. And, Magda pointed out right at the start of her talk that there's a real paucity of information, paucity of treatments around the venous circulation. She's one of the first to be looking at the venous circulation. And it's just think what she will have achieved. I think that by the end of her PhD, Magda, working essentially alone, will have put together a multi-scale model and will be on the cusp of being able to provide clinical insights. Now, I think that that's a considerable achievement. That's enough from me, actually.
Thank you, Ian.
Don't have anything to add.
Many thanks, Ian. Many thanks. Much good. Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think I can comment on one of the slides that Magda was showing, the computational requirements of these modeling processes, the sensitivity analysis, in the case of local, global executions, that these large-scale simulations really are challenging for the computing infrastructure. In terms of hardware, it's probably easy to get, but it also requires software and support. And here we can see that really we have these two different architectures. So it can be cloud, like Amazon AWS in a serverless model. There was also some Google Cloud used in this experiment, but also our high-performance computing, so RS cluster, and so on. And these challenges, coming from the real application scenario, are also very inspiring for the work that we do at Sano with other students, like PhD students and master students, bachelor students, who are experts in computer science, experts in infrastructure, in software development. And this is really a nice collaborative work, that we really appreciate. And with the next steps coming, so this 3D simulations, which are more demanding, we expect here to have more interesting challenges and hopefully some new solutions that we can develop together. So this is again very nice nice collaboration. And also we hope that the solutions, the tools we can develop can be useful not just for Magda, who is our first local user and often sometimes a patient, kind of alpha, beta tester of some of these tools, but also for the broader community. So this is a part of our, let's say, research agenda and the nice collaborative work. So we are looking forward to the further steps. Yeah, so this is a kind of comment from my side. But of course, it's important that we are not spending too much time on technologies rather than on delivering solutions. But sometimes these technologies are really needed. So that's why kind of teamwork is also important. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we are coming to end of this seminar. Magda, would you like to add something? Well, 1 minute for you. If you.
Well, thank you for all the questions and input contributions. It's always very useful for the future model development. So thank you.
Okay. Well, many thanks for everybody who, for Magda, of course, and for everybody who took part in this discussion. Well, maybe there will come time when other PhD students and Sano will learn how to, that they learn that they can also ask questions and give comments. I hope that sometimes it will come. Anyhow, I would like to invite all of you to the next seminar, which will be in a week from now, and it will be Emmanuel Ergogo from Health Informatics team about his PhD research. So many thanks and see you in a week from now.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day.